Um, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Helsing, Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project in the Carter School, the Center for Peacemaking Practice at George Mason University. And Marin O'Brien, Bill Hussein, and I will be your co-moderators in this session that's going to be focused on evidence-based peacemaking. And I think you'll find that this is a very rich discussion and a very, very important topic. We've heard from a number of people who've been participating over the last few days in their different sessions, and including a couple of the plenary speakers, about the importance not only of evidence, but telling the story of peacemaking and peacemaking successes. So this panel in particular is going to be focused on evidence, and not just its importance, not making the case for it, but how do we enhance the evidence that we're gathering? How do we collaborate with each other? What should we be doing to better tell our story? So there's a few key themes to this particular session. We're going to talk about rigor, inclusion, engagement, accessibility, methodology, and impact. And I think we have 5 terrific speakers to get at all of those themes in one way or the other. So to kick us off, I'm going to start with Connor Seil, who is with the One Earth Foundation, and he's going to talk about a study that was done to sort of lay the groundwork about what we've learned about evidence and how people think about evidence as a way to think about going forward. So Connor, thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all the participants out there. I agree, this model is interesting because I've got a little green number in my screen telling me there's people out there. But other than that, I'm just taking it on faith. But yes, what I'm going to be talking about today is the question of, is there space for a consensus, or is there even a consensus around the idea of evidence in peace building? And to start that, I'm going to ask an unfair question, which is, should we as a field try to understand what works and what doesn't, and preferentially do that which works? The reason that's an unfair question is that I'm fairly sure that at least 44 people suddenly said, well, it's not that simple, because it's not that simple. As soon as you move from this most banal general framing, this question touches some very hot button issues in peace building. It pretty much immediately hits issues of power, who gets to decide what works and who doesn't. And that touches issues of funders and implementers and traditionally powerful parties versus traditionally excluded parties. It touches issues of what counts as working. So that's the positive or negative peace debate, and what does peace look like? And it touches issues of epistemology. The formal epistemology, the qual versus quant and the randomistas and all the positivism and all the isms debate, but also a kind of a lived epistemology about whose voices are listened to. Who is in the room? All 3 of these issues, I would argue, are active topics of contestation within the peace building field, outside of the question of evidence. And so it's maybe not a surprise that most of the discussion that I've seen around evidence tends to focus on that contestation. It tends to emphasize the points where there are things to be worked out. But I think it's useful to call back to this very banal and basic way of framing it, because I suspect very few people in this room would disagree with this question at its heart. And that might be a foundation for next steps. So today, I'm going to be talking about the results of a survey that we did with Alliance for Peacebuilding on the perceptions of evidence within the peacebuilding field. This survey was structured to address a couple of questions. How do respondents think about the idea of evidence? And whatever that answer is, using that answer, where do people think evidence exists by phase of conflict, in terms of general conditions for peace, and also in terms of interventions to deliver these conditions. Thanks to partnerships with the Peace and Security Funders Group, Peace Science Society, and the Better Evidence Project, as well as the networks of Alliance for Peacebuilding and One Earth Future, the research team were able to get 207 responses from across the peacebuilding field, mostly from people in the peacebuilding NGOs and skewing towards the US and UK, although representing 35 different countries. So, with that, is there evidence for a consensus about evidence? Sort of. In that very abstract framing, is the idea of evidence important? There is actually a fairly strong consensus in our survey that the idea of evidence is important. We asked that using a Likert scale, and the mean was relatively high with a relatively small standard deviation, but standard deviation isn't for statistical reasons, that's not a great way to look at it. So we calculated a separate consensus score that shows a fairly high degree of consensus. So in the abstract, our respondents said, yes, we value evidence. It's important. We need it. However, when we got to asking people, well, what does evidence mean? That's where you see a little bit more of this fragmentation and contestation. We asked about this in two different ways. One was a closed answer question where people had to pick a forced choice response. The other was more open-ended. On the forced choice responses, a plurality, about 40%, said evidence is mixed methods. That's what is valuable. Getting past that 40%, there was a large minority that rejected the framing of the question and said, well, because we had asked about methods. And they said, no, evidence is not about methods. It's about, can you trust it? Is it rigorous? Does it deal with bias? Or is it incorporating local voices? So about 20% of the sample said, well, it's a much more abstract thing than just methods. And then getting past that, the single largest other group said evidence is case studies. So that's worth noting as well. But what I would call out is about 60% of our responses said evidence comes from having mixed ways of looking at it that are trustworthy. Getting into the open-ended questions, we see similarly a lot of variation, but a certain center of gravity. About a little more than a quarter of our responses said that evidence comes from having a variety of pieces of evidence, that it's not one single study, it's not one single method. It's a collection of existing research or a body of evidence showing that an intervention works or a condition is there. About 20% of our sample said, well, it is about method. But when you actually got into that, the most common answers had to do with the quality of the method or the idea that there was a trusted method or that it was mixed methods rather than just being purely a kind of a randomista versus a qualitative debate. And then another 14% explicitly said, well, it's about rigor. They use language there like mitigating bias or rigorous methods, which are both contentious ideas, but come back to this core of can you trust it? So again, what I would say is there is this aggregate that represents a fairly large chunk of the sample that is saying that evidence is what matters is that evidence communicates that it is trustworthy, that it represents accurately the world that's out there, and people have ideas about how to do that. That comes down to lots of different kinds of research, mixed methods, multiple converging approaches, what we would call in psychology a Brunswick's lens model. Other findings of interest are that there is much more perceived evidence for structural peace building, that is before or after conflict, rather than peacemaking, and for conditions describing peace, that is what does peace look like in the abstract, rather than specific interventions, with three pretty important caveats to that. Using the cutoff we used to say that there was some evidence, only 3 met that criteria for interventions, people saying the field knows how to do this. 2 of those had to do with increasing women's engagement in economic and political life and peace building broadly. And the third was education. So if we want to talk about evidence-based practice, I would say that those 3 interventions are good places to start. So calling back to this question, is there a consensus? No, I don't think I can fairly claim that there is. But I do think that I can claim that there is space for a consensus, or if not actually a true consensus, at least something that the majority of the field would look at and say, yes, this is an acceptable operating definition of what constitutes evidence that we can all live with. And I would argue, based off of our survey, that it means repeated mixed method assessments, whether that's research in the academic sense or assessments in the kind of impact evaluation sense, but having multiple different examples using mixed methods showing that things work. I also think that there's a strong, consistent perspective that this needs to include contextualized, localized understanding, which is a theme we've heard throughout PeaceCon. I think that this also needs to let us do two additional things. One is connect the what to the how. So not just describe peace in the abstract, but describe whether specific interventions help get us there. And then also tracking first and second order impacts. The work that we do needs to be successful on its own terms, but we're not doing it just for that. We're doing it because we believe it contributes to undermining larger conflict dynamics, to helping create stability. And being able to kind of think through those second order chains with assessments is important to understanding the kind of complex relationships that drive modern conflict. So, okay, so great. Based off of that, what next? Well, making this operational needs more. It needs more partnerships, more data, more building on collaborations, because what we need to be able to do is compare lots of different analyses of the same fundamentally similar interventions or conditions or dynamics to try to develop this kind of repeated mixed methods assessments. I think that the global impact framework that will be discussed, I think, later in this panel is an excellent operationalization for this. And One Earth Future is going to be working on bringing that into our own assessment so that we can contribute to this idea of some kind of aligned indicators to allow for repeated mixed method assessments that is also local, that also has space for localized, contextualized understandings. And specifically, as far as One Earth Future goes, we would want to help demonstrate this. We want to demonstrate transparency in our own work to contribute to the field as a whole. And we would love to partner with any of you folks listening on any of this. Shared learning, shared data, trying to develop some kind of comparative understanding, because I think our survey supports the idea that it's through that multiple different comparisons shared with each other and this kind of conceptual meta-analysis of what's out there that the field is going to arrive at a kind of a collective shared understanding. Thank you very much, and I'd encourage you to read the report if you are interested.
Terrific. Thank you, Connor. Thank you for starting us off and sort of helping us sort of understand the landscape and both where we've been and, in a way, where we need to go. Before I jump to Shadrach, who's next, I just want to emphasize that please put any questions you have in the chat room, and we will be monitoring those, and we'll have plenty of time for questions or comments after each of the presentations. In addition, any thoughts you have, any ideas to help us get to consensus, any thoughts about what's next, as Connor raised, please put those in the chat as well. We will be harvesting those, and as Connor said, we want you to contact us after this. We want to stay engaged, and we want to continue to collate, cultivate ideas about effective evidence or new ideas. How can we collaborate? How can we work better? And any ideas, any questions are certainly very welcome. If you want to be contacted by any of us or any of the organizations, put your information in the chat. As I said, we will be collecting this so that this is not just a one-off session, but there's going to be work and engagement that we can do after this session. So with that, let me turn to Shadrach Mwakitalu, who is the Design, Monitoring, and Evaluation Coordinator for the Swahili Coast for Search for Common Ground.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, terrific. We can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I think you have already introduced me. I'm Shadrach Mwakitalu. I'm working with the Search for Common Ground. I'm based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So I'm supporting the Swahili Coast. I'm coordinating actually the M&E activities. Okay, I'll be speaking about, I'll just giving the like the vivid examples from Swahili Coast context on how the global impact framework, we have introduced the global impact framework as the monitoring and evaluation framework for search for common ground on how it works for Swahili Coast program and how we use how that framework can help to correct some evidences as well as give the team time to reflect on what we have implemented. So as I said, the global impact framework is the framework which has been introduced by Search for Common Ground with key indicators which can be tracked across the geographical areas where we have interventions of peace buildings. So that is a short brief on the global impact framework. I hope Marine will talk on it in detail. But when I can speak about the Swahili Coast programs to tackle the complex conflict which is stemmed from Somalia, as we know, Somalia looks at the area where all the conflict streaming down to the coast of Indian Ocean, coming to the east coast of Africa, is where Somalia seems to be the source of all of the conflict, especially the violent extremism. So to tackle that problem, Search for Common Ground decided to come up with a conflict geographic approach, means the strategy defined by the boundaries of the conflict system rather than defining it at the border of any single country. So this strategy, named Swahili Coast, includes programs in Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, and northern part of Mozambique. But depending on the unfolding dynamics in Ethiopia, Swahili Coast may engage in the conflict zone of Ethiopia. Currently, Swahili Coast has projects operating in Kenya and Tanzania, but the business development team is trying the level best to find funds for Somalia and Mozambique. So let me go straight to the global impact framework. The global impact frameworks, as we know, are generated from the three pillars. We have three pillars which guide this global impact framework. So the first pillar is the lived experience, whereby Search for Common Ground decided to correct ideas, to correct the needs from the community when we are designing our project. So we identify indicators specifically relevant to the people living in the context of a particular conflict, and these indicators be used to adapt and refine global indicators over time. And the second pillar is the aligned measures. Here is where we have Search for Common Ground decided to come up with the key indicators which can be tracked globally, where we provide a global consistent language, measures of progress, and the trends to track that help people understand what the most influential in transforming conflict. And the last one, the last pillar is the shared reflection, where we track unexpected and immediate outcomes that due to the larger change in the conflict. By documenting this systematically, we can identify the patterns and the process of changes. So when it comes to the Swahili Coast, how does the global impact framework relevant and effective to the Swahili Coast? So the global impact framework facilitates Horn of Africa. When I say Horn of Africa, is Swahili Coast together with the Sudan. So to shift from monitoring and evaluation system for individual project to a single unified approach for a regional geographic conflict zone, which means Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Sudan, together with Ethiopia. The global impact framework enables the joint designing, monitoring, and evaluation activities across the multiple countries. As I said before, the source of most of the V issues within this geographic area are from the Somalia. And it seems like it's the same groups which is streaming down to the other countries. So we decided to come up with a strategy which unify all of these countries. So the global impact framework has been facilitated so to come up with the key indicators which can help to track the programs across these geographical area. So first of all, it provides a joint key indicators. For example, we have the indicators defined under physical violence, where we have the indicator like percentage of people, I mean percentage of the population that feels safe walking alone around the area where they live. And so from this indicator, you can see this indicator is cutting across all of the programs within the Swahili Coast. So now it is possible for Swahili Coast to reflect on how much the specific country contribute to this indicator, and as well as to the specific global impact framework key indicators from each aligned measure. And also the country program office will be able to learn about approaches used across the project countries which ensure evidence-based programming. For example, I can give an example. When we started to intervene in Kenya, where Al-Shabaab had where in Kenya we had a lot of V incidences happened like 5 years back in Kenya. So it seems like we have managed to reduce those incidences in Kenya, while those incidences seems like they are rising they are increasing in Mozambique and Tanzania. So by having these key indicators which cut across all of the geographic area, we'll be able to learn from Kenya on how Kenya they have managed to deal with these V incidences happen like in back 5 years. They've managed to reduce those incidents by big percent. So, but also the global impact framework enables us to have a joint reflection session, joint outcome harvesting as well. Before, we are just doing the reflection sessions per specific program. Each program has the reflection session where the program team got time like to reflect on the implementation they made and the changes which has been happened at the field level. But currently, the reflection session done at the project, but after having a shared key performance indicator, the reflection session can be done at a regional level. So we can be able to learn from one country to another one. And this will strengthen documentation and adaptation of best practices, and the learning, also joint outcome harvesting can be done through these reflection sessions. Also at this point, also I can give an example on the situation happening now in Mozambique and Tanzania at the border, whereby recently we have the governments of Mozambique announced the death of one of the V group leader in Mozambique, and they claimed like that V group leader was from Tanzania, while the government of Tanzania also claiming that the coordinators for the V groups happening in Tanzania seems to be from Mozambique. So it seems like the two countries pointing fingers to each country. But if we are going to have the joint reflection from the programs in Mozambique and the programs in Tanzania, it will be easy for us to understand well these V groups and understanding what kind of intervention we can come up so that we can address this conflict within the border of Tanzania and Mozambique. And lastly, since GIF is smoothing the process of developing the regional meal framework, which has key indicators for regional level, and at the same time, the geographical area has its own strategic plan. So these regional strategic documents will support the business development team to come up with the program and the project with intervention which can cut across multiple countries within the geographic area. So this can address spillover across the countries. As I said, the conflict in Kenya, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Ethiopia is like the spillover from Somalia. So having the joint program which cut across the 5 countries, it will be easy to address the spillover from these countries. And the V groups in this region speak to each other. So we need also at the actors, we need to speak to each other from these multiple countries so that we can manage to come up with the proper strategies in handling this situation. And also, this will enable the actors to understand where we should invest much and how much to invest in response to various triggers, while being conscious to spillover effect in the other countries. So within this intervention, the global impact framework, from these different aligned measures, we can understand where we are performing well and where we are not performing well, and what is the implication of not performing well in these kind of indicators. So we understand where we should invest much, and take into consideration this spillover effect in our programming, and also invest in the program rather than individual countries. So due to the time, maybe let me give the summary of what I have spoken. So in short, in nutshell, the global impact framework has been contributed to the to correct all the learnings across the Horn of Africa countries. We normally, it can facilitate correction of these learnings from different countries, but also can transform the program from being accountable to our donor. In most of our programs, we normally implement and we normally correct all the evidences just to be accountable to the funders of these projects. But from the first pillar of lived evidence and experience, we can be able to collect needs. We can be able to do need assessment from the beneficiaries before we come up with the design of our projects. So we can be more accountable to our beneficiaries rather than just concentrating much to be accountable to donors only. And also can establish the contribution made by each country in transforming these conflicts around the geographical area. So that's, in short, that is how the global impact framework, which has been initiated by Search for Common Ground, can be important to the Swahili Coast programs. Yeah, maybe let me end here and allow for the questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Shadrach. And I think you've really given us a very good sense of the application of an evidence-based framework, but also I really liked how you embodied sort of shared reflection. The sharing, I think, is an important part of how we're thinking about and applying evidence. So that was particularly instructive. We're now going to turn to Oscar Vargas, who's joining us from Colombia. And Oscar is the research associate for Everyday Peace Indicators. So thank you for joining us, Oscar.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you all the people who attend this today and to the people who is with me talking today. What I would like to present you today is how from Everyday Peace Indicators we propose and we do measuring of peace in different countries. And as I am based in Colombia, I'm going to talk something general about what we do, but also more specific of what we've been finding in Colombia. So there's different questions around how to measure peace in any context. And one of the main questions that we address and that inspire us to work is the scale. And this is because we understand that many of the decisions that the governments, the public politics done by politicians are done around the peace usually are not only taken, but they are thought in places that are different from the communities that are into the conflict. And sometimes that that makes that the kind of analysis to take this peace political public politics has wrong inputs. For example, many of the times that someone do this peace analysis, they do it taking big, huge regions as the place, and understanding that all is the same in different regions and in different communities. And we find that this is wrong. We have to go to a smaller scale to understand what the people understand about peace and about coexistence and about justice. That's why everyday peace indicators starts a methodology where we begin constructing the indicators for measuring with the people, and not we don't construct the indicators in our desktops in our cities, but we go to the communities, most of them rural communities, and talk with the people and ask them what they understand for peace and for justice. And that's why we find some different meanings of these words that usually in our liberal understanding of the world, for example, peace is only the absence of armed conflict and the absence of armies, the absence of some criminal stuff. But when we talk with the people, we found that there are many other understandings of the peace itself. So we've been doing this work since a few years ago, but we have luck in work with different communities in different countries of the world, as you see. And what we do is we go to the communities, we start some focal groups, and we make some conversations with the people, create by themselves a lot of indicators, and then we prioritize them with some voting process and so on. And at the end, these indicators let us make some surveys and try to find if the things that the people are thinking about peace are happening or not in their communities. So this methodology let us understand, we think, better not only the meanings of peace, justice, coexistence, and so on, but also the logics of the communities in the different countrysides. So we find that there are different advantages of this methodology around the scope, the ownership, the empowerment, and, as I said, the scale. I told you at the beginning of my presentation that I work in Colombia, and in Colombia right now is where Everyday Peace Indicators has his biggest project in the world. We currently have 3 ongoing projects in different regions of the country, and one of them I want to present one of the findings of one of these projects that is called Everyday Justice in Colombia. And that is a project that tried to understand how after the peace agreement with the former guerrilla FARC, some towns receive state institutions and state different public money and so on around what the state thought the peace is going to happen. And we try to understand the difference between some towns that had a lot of intervention of the state and others that don't. So as you see in the map, I'm going to talk about two regions. One that is Antioquia, that is northwest, and other that is Cauca, that is southwest. There we find really interesting stuff around what the people understand around peace, coexistence, and so on. For example, one of the indicators that we found with the ex-guerrilla people are these two. For example, for them, peace is that the political struggle continues with words and not with weapons. And this is interesting because it's like for them, peace is not only to stop the fighting with arms, but it's also to continue working in politics with their proposals, political proposals, or this other. There is an offer of technical and technological education for ex-combatants. And this is crucial because as they have been more than 2 or 3 decades in the guerrilla, more of them don't have any opportunity of study. So for them, peace is to study. Let's see how different is, and not so different because the guerrilla were also peasants in a way. But let's see indicators of peasants that didn't organize in a military organization. Some peasants says that the young people of the community gather to collect garbage in the field. This is their indicator of how peace will be in their community. And also is complementary with there is a good waste management in Urama. So normally we don't think that peace is about waste management. We don't have this on mind. And this is interesting because when you start to analyze this and you make the surveys, you find that maybe there is no peace because in several regions there are not good waste management. Something that I want to overlay here is that in Colombia, I hope you know, we have a huge diversity of cultures. So after United States and Brazil, we are the 3rd country with most African descendant people. And let's see these indicators of them. For example, the Guardia Cimarrona, that is like a own security dispositive of some Afro-Colombians descendants. The Guardia Cimarrona exercises control so that no strangers enter the community. There are gatherings with friends and family after at the river. People are not forced by necessity to work on illicit crops. Older people in the community dance fuga and torbellino at parties. The children of San Miguel practice traditional dances. What we see here is that there are differences if you have one or another culture, and there are differences if you live in one or another part of the country, and you cannot generalize. But there is the question around how do you do when you find this so different information? How do you do to scaling up this information and trying to make I'm going to steal like 2 more minutes. How do you generalize some ideas? We don't know exactly, but we are trying to do it with categorization of the indicators and trying to collect them in different areas of life. And as you see, for example, some of the of these dimensions that has categories are around armed actors, dealing with the past, culture and society, security, rights and dignity, economic activity and livelihood. And as the time goes by, we found that we need to enlarge these categories to get in some new around indigenous people, Afro-descendant people, and try to do it in different ways. I would like to tell you more, but I don't have time. I only want to give you some final thoughts around one of our main concerns of this panel, and is what's next in general. One of the main concerns that in EPA we have is that we cannot treat the people as an object. We cannot treat the people as something to study, because when we arrive to these places and we gather some information, if we are not responsible with them, we only are repeating the extractive way of Occidental life. And this is one of the main questions that we should ask every time. And is the stuff that we study around peace is for us or is for the people that is living in the conflict? I think that we have to think in this to get better in our research, but also in what are the consequences of what we do. So excuse me for being so late. The Colombians talk a lot, so thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. A perfect presentation in terms of time. And in fact, I think you gave us all a really strong, not just analysis, but an illustration of what everyday indicators really means. And I think your point at the end about how important it is not to engage in extractive processes and how one has to really think very deeply about evidence and what it means, and also what it means to sort of get people where they live and understand their everyday concerns. Because peace is, after all, something that has to be lived and made on an everyday basis. So thank you very much for that. We will now turn to Olivia Russell. Olivia is the Director of Programs and Operations at ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. And she'll talk a bit about the work they do in developing evidence. So thank you, Olivia.
Thanks, Jeff. You said the full name, so I can just say the acronym now. So first, I just want to say how much I've been appreciating, kind of, even as a panelist, the presentations that have come so far, and echo the point that you just made, Jeff, with regards to the kind of fighting this extractive dynamic that can emerge from global relationships with local partners. And that's something that we think about a lot at ACLED. So you've already introduced me. I think I'll kind of jump straight into giving a little bit of background about, oops. There we go. I was lost inside the Visivo platform. A little bit of background about ACLED. One of the things I wanted to share too is that I do come from this to this conversation with my perspective from ACLED as like a global data set, which I'll talk about a little bit, but I also have a background in peace building and working with local organizations on the ground. And so I kind of swivel back and forth when I think about these things and the interplay between the organizations on the ground and then us in kind of the global community, I guess, or the bigger data sets and projects that are interacting. So kind of try to see from both of those perspectives. So I want to first give a little bit of background on ACLED in order to speak about our partner model, which has some lessons for this discussion that we're having and things that we've been grappling with. So first, who is ACLED? So like I said, you've already said the full name. We are the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, and we really focus on collecting information on political violence and demonstrations. So that's our catchment, our focus as a data set. We are an independent nonprofit. We were born out of an academic background. Our executive director developed ACLED when she was in her postdoc. And so we kind of keep this one foot in academia and ongoing relationship with academia and methodological development. We're a fully remote team, so we're technically registered in Wisconsin, but we're fully digital office. When I used to say that back in the day, that was like a very novel thing that we would like champion. But now obviously everybody has experienced that. So it's much more just descriptive now at this point, but still bears repeating. And one thing about ACLED, I think, given that description, is that we come to this conversation as somewhat outside of peace building in a way, and we work with a lot of peace builders. And so we have this different vantage point, and those are some of the things, like the lessons that we learned from that perspective, that I wanted to highlight. So as I said, ACLED is first and foremost a data set collecting information on political violence and protest. So it's an event-based data set, and we have some information there which outlines really what type of information about incidents we collect. And this will kind of connect to how our partner model functions, that I'll talk about a little bit. So we collect information about when the incidents took place, where, so everything is mappable and has geocoordinates attached to it. The engagement type, so this really spans many different types of violence, from battles to protests and riots and everything in between. So we capture that information, sub-event types as well, so we can kind of disaggregate for what type of information is being collected. We collect information about the actors and the actor type, so we can understand the relationship dynamics and allies and things like that in the violence dynamics that we're observing. And then finally, we do provide or record conservative fatality estimates that can kind of feed into a certain type of indicator. Spatial and temporal coverage, I just wanted to touch on. We are just arriving at global coverage, actually, in the next month. So we'll be releasing information on Oceania, Canada, and Antarctica. There's apparently a few protests of scientists there that, so we've also covered Antarctica. So basically, this is us arriving at global coverage and pausing and thinking too about how we integrate data from all over the world and partners everywhere. So I wanted to just quickly touch on our sourcing. We collect information from a wide range of sources that are listed here. And I wanted to share this just to tee up a discussion about our partner model. So the first few source types listed there are our key sources relating to media. So we pull in everything from BBC to Radio Dabonga in Sudan. That's in 100 languages. So we really kind of collect information from a lot of different places. We do rely upon new media in some cases. We do not crowdsource. So this is vetted new media sources like Twitter accounts and Telegram channels. And then we rely on some of the kind of usual suspects of large organizations, international organizations providing reports. So UN Group of Experts, Amnesty, et cetera. And then the most important and what we see as the centerpiece of our methodology is our sources at the local level. So our local partners. These are described here as local conflict observatories, but that really is kind of a catch-all term for many different types of organizations, from media bodies, human rights organizations, and in a few cases, businesses even, that collect their own information on the ground. There's a few examples there in Guatemala, Bahrain, Sierra Leone, and Nepal, organizations that actually were on another PeaceCon panel this morning that I think if it was recorded, people can listen to the really interesting work that they're doing. But our partner model, just to talk about it a little bit more, there are 50 partners that we work with or more, and each partner covers a different country, subnational area, and a different type of violence. So these are an extremely diverse group of organizations that are feeding into ACLED's global platform. And we work with these organizations in order to integrate their data into our data set by first understanding their catchment. So what is it that they're looking at and is important in their community and their country? What's their methodology? So in some cases, that means that the information, in some cases, organizations have done more work to document their methodology. In others, it's more verbal and it hasn't been noted down. And so we work with them to understand that. Their coverage, so what are they covering regionally, and then to integrate their data into our data set. We also do work on the other side to support our partners, spurred by their interests. So they really drive this to train them on data collection and management, and analysis and visualization if that's of interest to them. So that can be another element to our partnerships. I think one of the things that we have found most interesting is working with these very diverse organizations who are covering so many different countries and places, like some of the examples I mentioned, and types of violence that is very different. It looks different, and they're, monitoring drug-related violence in Manila and violence against women in Mexico and everything in between, airstrikes in Yemen. And how do you take this body of information and integrate it into a global data set in a fashion that allows for cross-border comparison and consistency in the methodology to allow for that global analysis and cross-country analysis. I hope I'm not going over my time. I just recognize that. So kind of the last points that I wanted to make were about, from this partner model that we've had, what have we seen as key challenges and how are we trying to kind of engage with them or grapple with them, I guess. Some lessons learned that maybe we could share. I think integrating these diverse local data streams, one of the things that we've really tried to do is to ensure that we're not imposing, so this is kind of to Oscar's point in a way, we're not trying to impose our methodology upon these partners. We're working with them to find those who are creating really rich data in the field and in their local communities, and connecting it to what we already have, so that there's this really kind of natural alignment between what they're doing and what we're producing on the global scale. And so I think to do that, what we found is that you do need innovative and creative methodologies, like an event data set or something that allows, that spans many different approaches that allows for that integration. You should seek out local partners that have that natural alignment and that there is that connection, so that you're not seeking to impose a methodology or a focus, because all of the groups that we work with, they're monitoring those things that they're focused on, of course, because that's interesting and useful in their context for their purposes. So there's no reason for us to try to adjust that. We just want to capture it and work with them to integrate it to enrich our data. And so those are some of the things that we learned. One of the things that I would mention too, that we've been just talking about a lot more, is facilitating the links between these groups as well. They've increasingly vocalized interest in kind of information sharing and learning among themselves. So kind of bilateral engagement and how much they learn from one another in doing that. And then of course it enriches the ecosystem of data as well. So I think those are some things that we've learned. Finally, a point, and maybe this tees up your discussion, Leslie, is about funding and supporting these organizations. Long-term data collection is difficult to fund for many different reasons that I think everybody here knows. One being that often we collect data in our project cycle, and so we have gaps naturally, and gaps in funding equate to gaps in data often, not always, but in a lot of these local organizations. And we see that regularly, in the sense that a lot of our partners talk to us about the struggles to find funding that is consistent and supports this work. So I think I'll end on that point about the importance of supporting those types of projects and consistent data collection through time, even outside of discrete projects. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Olivia. And really interesting evidence, if you will, of the value of collaboration. And I think both the bilateral local to local, but also your organization with local partners. And it's that sharing, that collaboration, that I think has become a common theme through so many of the presentations and what we're focused on here. So our last full presentation will be Leslie Winjender, who's the Director of Peacebuilding at Humanity United. And as Olivia sort of teed up, we'll bring a donor perspective to developing and making use of evidence. So thank you, Leslie.
Great. Good afternoon. Good evening to everyone. I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel. And also so excited to come after these excellent presentations by Oscar, Shadrach, and Olivia and Connor. I think you've teed up amazing different points of views at different levels, and this is exactly what we want to be discussing more in the field of peace building measurement. So what I wanted to bring today is the role that donors have in helping connect the evidence. And I wanted to start with understanding a little bit our role already in how we've shaped evidence. So we're coming from a place, many donors, where we have had a specific pressure to show the return on an investment. The ROIs, that's been really strong in different bilateral organizations, especially in the UK. There's also been a specifically narrow focus on the impact of projects, of each project. But when you stand back, there are hundreds and thousands of projects. So, but we've had this narrow focus on just the success of a specific project. To what Connor mentioned earlier, there is a focus on supporting what matters, what works well, but determining what works well is not. There's not a consensus about that, and who determines that is definitely something we need to question, and we're really grappling with that as a field right now. I find that there's a questionable amount of focus on pilots and innovation, again, especially from foundations and private donors, that it's always more exciting to fund a pilot as opposed to long-term committed funding to long-term change. As we know, change takes a long time to change. And so there's also that aspect in the funding field, and then just impact. I mean, the capital I impact, it drives a lot of the stress, and it's also not well defined, or it's defined from different perspectives. So again, it's something where I just want to check ourselves as to like where we're coming from. So we could just have this model, a new logical model for ourselves, and I think we could just end the presentation here, which I really do think there's an ongoing debate now in all of the discussions around localization and decolonizing aid that is really worth bringing into this discussion as well. But I wanted to bring you back, actually, when I have experience. I'm at Humanity United right now. I've been a part of INGOs. I've been a part of local community-based action groups. And this slide that I'm showing right now comes from a presentation that the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium, which was an 8-year project between different in the peacebuilding field, that was really trying to hone into what is good M&E practice in the peacebuilding field. And this was one of the last slides from a couple of years ago that Jessica Baumgardner Zuzik and Carrie O'Neill presented, and it was, what is the purpose of M&E? And when I was looking at it, it gave me a visual of all the different places that data was coming from. We were talking about data, but when I saw it in this beehive format, it finally illuminated to me that all of these pieces of information are important, but they're providing different types of information for us. So whereas we were coming at it and debating like, well, that's not evidence and that's not strong enough, it's because we were talking past each other when I had evidence about how our team was self-reflecting and adapting as to how they could better implement a program. But that wasn't information that would actually tell you about the impact, the final impact of the program. But the final impact of the program will be influenced by how the program team is working. And that's all very valuable. So that for me was an enlightening moment. And I think it speaks to where we want to move to as a field, that there's an ecosystem of data. I'm showing up here this multicolored hexagon is the Dac Evaluation Criteria, right? Of relevance, coherence, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, sustainability. All of those are important. But then we have to make choices between the timeline, budgets, the focus of a project, the interests of who wants to learn about what. It would be wonderful to do all 6 of those all the time, but that's most of the time impossible. So on the right side, we have this network of actors, both donors, INGOs, communities, local CBOs, community-based organizations, regional level monitoring evaluation, like what Shadrach represents in his work and with his team, Olivia with ACLED, we have different data sets. So we really need to come together and operate together to expand the pie and not think it's always just one piece of the pie. So with that, I think the call for all donors is to understand that we are a part of that ecosystem. We are a player, and we have influenced it in one way a bit negatively, but we can influence it in other ways due to what strengths we bring and what resources we have. We can help visibilize, it's a word in Spanish, the ecosystem of people and organizations. Often, if I'm funding several organizations, many organizations don't know about each other. Each of us are operating in different networks, and being able to see what those networks are without a competition, although competition will continue to be very present, there's an opportunity for us to visibilize the ecosystem and to support learning events and networking opportunities, such as this one. And there's a continued call for us to support financially, as well as other support that we may be able to provide both to the organizations or the networks. And to this point, I think it gets at also supporting the work itself, but supporting the organization. Again, if one of these local partners that Olivia was just talking about is able to continue to grow as an organization in their own operations, they'll have much more impact than any one data collection activity that they might be taking. While I might want to know the outcome of that data collection activity as an entity, it's also key to support that organization or ACLED or any one of these. The organization and the group or the network itself is very important to support. So a call to donors to support organizational capacity and what that looks like. And finally, to be held accountable more to the people, the communities, and the organizations that are closest to the work, as opposed to our own ideals of what we want to see happen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Leslie. Well, a lot of good points to consider, including, I think one of the thing that stuck out most to me is how often we talk past each other. And I think there's just such a need to find ways to, as we're modeling here, collaborating and understanding that together we're going to be able to make a difference much more than so many different disparate types of projects or data sets or the competition for resources and funding, et cetera. So all really important points to consider. I'm now going to turn quickly to Maren, who's just going to briefly give us a sense of the global impact framework that is going to be rolled out soon and that Shadrach had mentioned, and then we'll shortly turn to questions. So, Maren.
Thanks, Jeff. And picking up on some of the points you're summarizing and that our other panelists have spoken to throughout here, I'm going to just drop a link in the chat to a full presentation for the room as to what is the global impact framework. Everybody should be able to access this. In summary, over the past few years, Search has been asking the question, how do we better tell the story of peace, both as an organization, as well as a member of this field? And so we are in conversation with all of the organizations on the panel, as well as sort of bringing others together and inviting you all in the room to help us answer this question, how do we better tell the story of peace? What we would propose, and it looks like I'm not operating the screen share quite correctly, but what we would propose is this concept of a global impact framework. It's a way to take the different components of information and different data sources that have been described here, from sort of everyday peace indicators and community-based indicators, to the type of ACLED data that Olivia is describing, to some of the bigger questions too that Leslie raised in the chat. How do these relate to the Sustainable Development Goals? How do we take these different types of evidence, sort of these connections that all of us are trying to make to peace, to tell a larger story and have a framework to say, this is how it all adds up. So I'm going to try the screen share one more time to run you through sort of a proposal for how this might all add up. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, it's working.
So how it might all add up is something called a global impact framework. Search has been, to use the danger word that Leslie just put out there, Search has been piloting the global impact framework in different ways, as Shadrach described. But we've tried to create a simple framework that captures a few different things. First, having a few thematic areas, 5 thematic areas with 2 indicators each that together present a set of aligned measures that we can track both as an organization, but that we know others in the field are already tracking. I'll run through the indicators over the next few slides. We have some indicators of physical violence that are part of the SDGs. We're trying to call other partners who are tracking these indicators to say, sort of, are you integrating these indicators into any of your work? Are you thinking about how you're contributing to these particular SDGs? Please share the data with us. We'd love to track them collectively. We know that we can't think about these sort of areas or indicators alone. So we have these indicators of personal agency that sort of capture positive and negative aspects of peace. For example, we may see that Mercy Corps has done great work to show that when sense of personal agency goes up, we might also see that instances of physical violence go up. People are taking up arms because they believe that they can make a difference in their world, but we're really looking about and adapting this indicator. Can we make a positive difference through increased personal agency, but recognizing that positive and negative dimensions of peace? We've consulted with partners and identified indices that other organizations in the field are utilizing to track polarization, a very hot topic throughout the world today, and thinking through how we understand polarization in relation to some of the other themes of aligned measures. Institutional legitimacy. Here again, we see the SDGs and other ways to track indicators of institutional legitimacy through services from authorities or the type of services that individuals around the world might look to from their governments. We also think it's important to be tracking resource investments, in part because that's part of how we're acting together in the field. Of these aligned measures, we're disaggregating them, we're thinking about different groups, but we're really trying to pull it all together to say, if we're focused on these aligned measures, how do we also at the same time understand lived experience of conflict? Search has been partnering with EPI and Humanity United, grappling with this question of, can we develop a methodology for community-based indicators that works within the projectized world so many peacebuilding organizations are living in, but also is really relevant to the lives of people living in conflict and responsive to their priorities and their experiences, as we've talked a lot about today. We want to be able to say, while we get into the nitty-gritty of individual conflict contexts, we need some level of generalizability, as Connor called for, as others have called for. And that's what these aligned measures provide. We also want to recognize conflict always throws the unexpected at us. We can never plan for it in a long frame in advance. So like many other organizations were search is experimenting with outcome harvesting and pairing that with community-based indicators, aligned measures, and then shared reflection to say, what are we contributing to? How are we adapting? How are we responding to the conflict environment in which we live? So our call to action, like I said, we could not put this framework into place as a single organization. We are really looking to be a part of this conversation. Jeff sort of indicated, please put your contacts in the chat. We'd love to continue it, but we're also hoping to convene everyone interested on the Connexus platform. I'll put the link in the chat if someone else hasn't already, but we're going to be putting together and launching a set aspect of the Connexus platform that will allow people to put in their data on aligned measures. We're trying to experiment with how do we share these stories of peace, and really would hope that you all are a part of the conversation too. So that's sort of the framework for how we're trying to build up all of these different threads of evidence into a story, both one that we see our organizations contributing to, but also as a field that we can come together at the end and say, here's how we're advancing peace, here's where we still need to focus, here's what we're missing, and collectively interrogate that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Maren. And just on behalf of the Better Evidence Project, I want to note that we as an organization are committed not only to developing a resource center to provide a place to share evidence, to promote evidence, particularly innovative new evidence, and to amplify local voices. But also we want to address one of the issues that was raised is oftentimes we don't know about each other. And so we're committed to being a kind of hub that can connect others with local or global organizations, but also a sense of what's happening in different places in the world. I'll just quickly note that I had a terrific conversation earlier this morning with Christine Bell, who's a law professor at the University of Edinburgh. There's a new kind of data set around peace agreements that's going to be coming out in the next month or two called Peace Rep. And we talked about we use one example, safe zones during ceasefires and transition periods. There are organizations, local peacemakers on the ground who are interested in learning more about what has worked, what have others experienced. And so she had said, we don't know enough about what some of the local organizations are that they could connect to. We don't have good ties into what the US is doing. The Europeans are doing other things. So that's part of our mission, is to create connections between individuals, organizations, those who are working in this area. So I think the watchword is very much collaboration and sharing experiences, and going back to Oscar's point, really getting at everyday indicators and evidence, not just the meta data that oftentimes predominates. So with that, let's turn to some questions or comments from those of you in the audience. And Maren, have you been able to moderate and see what others have on their minds?
So we haven't received questions yet in the chat, but would welcome those in the virtual room to put them in. I think that's going to be the easiest way to track, rather than having people virtually raise their hands or calling on people. So very much welcome questions from the floor, and we'll give people maybe a minute or so to think about those. In the meantime, I might pose a question to our panelists and just say, Leslie wrote raised this point about competition between organizations, and I think that's very real as well. If others have seen good practice and searches grappling with this question, how do we incentivize sharing evidence between organizations? Is there a reason why you feel like you're more empowered to share evidence? Or Olivia, for example, you're aggregating evidence. Is that part of why you think organizations have been willing to be a part of ACLID and enable you to aggregate evidence?
I guess I can comment on that. I mean, I agree. I think it's a really central issue that organizations deal with from the ground up, to global organizations. ACLID thinks about this a lot in the context of our model, and kind of the questions of open data, really, and where and how you can share data in order to maintain your kind of competitive advantage is the wrong way. It brings up lots of points around this competition, and I think we naturally kind of think about it this way. One of the things we've done at ACLID for the global data set is we've constructed a model where we're always sharing data, but deeper engagement and supporting whether that's donors or partners to use the data in different ways, and kind of offering that as a service in a way incentivizes support to us, let's say for one part, but also those like deeper connections with the data and the analysis, so that you're working together with other partners. At the local level, I think one of the things that's really helpful to us is that sustainability component, is that we work with local partners outside of a project cycle. So we do reach out and forge partnerships when we identify a new potential partner or they reach out to us, but that happens outside of a particular project. We report on it to a lot of our donors who are interested in it, but once a certain project ends, like that relationship continues regardless. And the information sharing, coaching in both directions is something that, yes, of course, it takes resources, but we see it as like part and parcel of our mission and our regular operations outside of specific discrete projects. And I think maybe that piece is, less of it being, 3 activities in this project cycle related to local partner engagement, and more so it's just our everyday life. That's what we're doing regularly, is that sharing of information. I'm not sure that helped add more concrete lessons learned, but that's kind of part of our experience.
Oh, I think it is. And Connor, I welcome you coming in on this point before we turn to Jared's question on the floor.
Great, thank you. And I think Oscar wanted to come in also. But just briefly on this, I've seen this from both sides. I've worked in grant-seeking organizations and I've worked in grant-making organizations. And my suspicion about one reason why we see so little data sharing is on the grant-seeking side, there is a very natural assumption that documenting your errors is going to hurt you. There's this sense of like, we can't air dirty laundry. We have to tell this story that we're excellent, we're successful, we're so good. I think that that's a natural fear, and I think it makes sense. I don't think it's true. I actually think that, especially in the modern philanthropic era where donors are paying attention to evidence and donors want to see evidence of learning, I actually think that the incentive that institutions will be rewarded for demonstrating that they are learning. And that means partially showing, here's where we succeeded, but here's also where we failed. And so I think that what's happening is there is a very reasonable perception in the field that sharing sensitive information could hurt you by demonstrating that, you're not perfect and not everything you do works perfectly all the time. But the reality is, increasingly, we know that. I think there's very few sophisticated actors in the field who would expect that any project, no matter how experienced the executors are, would achieve every single one of its goals completely with no hiccups along the way. That's just not the way that the world works. And so what I would suggest is I encourage everybody to start sharing your data, start kind of getting a little bit out there. I mean, certainly on the OEF side, the fact that we are willing to do that has led partners to be much more comfortable working with us as a partner or even as a funder in some cases when they are funding us. So our experience is that actually you get more out of being open. I understand the hesitancy. It's a very natural response, but I think it's based off of an incorrect assumption about what is going to be incentivized within the field.
Oscar, please come in too.
I just want to add that, as I said, why are we doing this? Because we want to have a name in a book, or because we want to have a big position in a newspaper sometimes. If we think that we do this because of the people that are living the conflict and that are looking forward to obtain the peace, we need to understand that if we do it for that, we need to share our data. It's like why we are not sharing our data if we want to help the people. But also I think that this question should be with another question, and is how do we let the people know this information? Because this information is in the universities, the think tanks, the NGOs, and when we give this information to the people, it's like in Chinese or in German if you are in a Spanish country. It's like with data that is not available because it's not pedagogical. So we need to address that two questions all the time together. And not only why we aren't sharing our data, but also why we aren't sharing our data with the people, not only with us.
That's a really key point. Absolutely. And appreciate that perspective. It really should be a conversation, two ways. I want to turn to a question that Jared's raised in the chat, and for Olivia, sort of how local, sort of by region, county, municipality, census tract, do you think ACLED will be able to provide information it deems usable?
So thanks for the question. I think I was scanning through, and so I think you were relating that to the United States, where we've just expanded as of last year. So currently what we provide is down to, I guess, what would be called the municipality level. I don't know about census tract and what kind of like size polygon that would be, but we do provide quite local data as each event is mappable, so it has a latitude and longitude attached to it. So the data are very local. I think you mentioned peacebuilding and kind of connecting that to peacebuilding kind of priorities and activities. And I think that's one of the things through that project. And we were working with the Bridging Divides Institute at Princeton. We had been grappling with kind of how do we help the users of the data who are taking that very hyper local lens that it sounds like you are. How do we help them to make use of the data, and what does it tell them about protest or riot dynamics and police response or far right activity where they are? So I think hopefully that answers the specific part of your question, but I think what I'm alluding to is there's a lot more work I think to be done of connecting that hyperlocal availability of data to use in specific peacebuilding activities.
And I'll respond to Nicole's question about data security, and just to provide, I think also being really nuanced when we say sharing data and what does that look like? I mean, sharing the hard data of baselines, I think that's at a different level and requires a different conversation. I remember being in conversation when I was at Mercy Corps with Search for Common Ground when we were both working in a similar area and doing a survey, a baseline survey as to like, so we could monitor and evaluate our programs. And we didn't come to an agreement. We recognized we were trying to find a way where we could use each other's data in the sense of why ask the same question, except that when we actually looked at our survey questions, we disagreed on what questions should be asked. So therefore you kind of then both went to your corners, and getting into the data security. I mean, that would be sharing that raw data would not actually happened. But I think it just a knock up though of like, what were the patterns? And that was partly to Search's credit, their conflict scans, sharing the information of what they were seeing at a higher level, not exposing any identifiable information, but how do we use that, and how could Mercy Corps or different organizations use that assessment, even though it was seen as search? I mean, that's where the competition came in, because it was very useful. It was like they picked up on this dynamic. So actually, why don't I go a step further? Instead of asking my own question, build off of that question to get more nuance around it. And so I think us, sharing data and not sharing data. It's not really sharing data. I think it's connecting. I think it's the experiences and what you're seeing, because we all come at it at different approaches. Search has a certain methodology, but I can still learn from that, even if I want to implement and engage the community in a different way. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to share regarding that question.
Just to follow up on that, Leslie, since you've gone through the experience of Mercy Corps, but now you're on the donor side, is that type of collaboration something that not just would you encourage, but is that something where in the middle of a project, could the recipients of funds come back to you and say, we have this opportunity, and can we expand what we're doing and build in collaboration? And I ask that question because I'm just right now in the process of working with a grantee on, okay, how do we pivot in the middle of a grant to sort of make use of what evidence is emerging on the ground, and how do we expand the original sort of goals of a particular project?
Yeah, 100%. I think having, that's where continued, I think that is coming to the fore about what are the flexibility measures already in place in a grant where you can adapt midway. And actually, this could be one that maybe you laid out that we were going to monitor it this way, but then you found a resource that already existed. So you should be able to either bring that into your learning framework or pivot in a certain way, because that discussion should be had with the donor on the onset. And that's both from the organization seeking it and from the donor side, having that conversation. I would say we've attempted this in many ways. I think it was 2015, 16, where the CAR impact framework, there were 5 different organizations who were trying to collate all the information. There was an attempt, and it was really hard because at the end we started on it afterwards, after the projects were funded by different like mainly USAID or DRL. There was one private sector, but we were, as the actor, as the Mercy Corps person, I was still beholden to that donor. And so I did have certain indicators I needed. So this gets at the global impact framework. Like, what are some core indicators that we might have that can be utilized across the field, while also being able to be contextualized once you are in a certain area? To the great slide that Oscar was showing, it was just some places security might mean being able to walk at night, and other places it means motorcycles on the corners, so, but the security might have been the overall category right above that.
Yeah, thanks. We are out of time, and there's an offstage voice that's saying, you're done. Thank you to everyone on the panel. Thank you to my co-facilitator, Maren, Connor, Shadrach, Oscar, Olivia, and Leslie. All terrific presentations, and I think a very nice mix of sort of looking at the big picture and really drilling down into the importance of and understanding the local issues. And then thanks to everyone who was in the audience and participating. I know we didn't get many questions, but we really got a lot of people sending their contact information and a lot of good enthusiasm for continuing this. So we will try and make use of the chat room and retain the contacts. And there's going to be opportunities going down the road with the global impact framework and other opportunities for all of us to continue to sort of work on enhancing evidence. Maren, do you want to add any other concluding remarks?
No, just final thank you, and please visit Connexus and reach out to us. I know some of us have shared contact details in the chat. You all have shared yours, so we'll be in touch. Enjoy the end of PeaceCon.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.